3 o'clock in the morning, a train weighing hundreds of tons screeches to a halt in the middle of the black English countryside, at a place where it was never meant to stop. The driver stares at the red light ahead of him and frowns. There's no station here, no scheduled stop here, just darkness and a signal telling him to stand still. His co-driver climbs down and walks to the line-side phone to ask the signalman what's wrong. He lifts the receiver. Silence. The line has been cut, and in the moment he realizes something is very, very wrong. It's already too late. What he doesn't know is that the red light ahead isn't broken. It's fake. A glove stuffed over the green lamp to hide it. A 6-volt battery wired in to switch the red one on. What he doesn't know is that in the darkness around him, 15 masked men are waiting. And what nobody, not even they, could know is that the flawless plan these 15 men spent months building is about to fall apart. Not because of the police, not because of a traitor, but because of a board game. To understand what happened that night, we have to go back a few months. England, 1963. Up to this point, the country held a quiet source of pride, a vast railway network that had run for decades without a single major robbery. Trains were considered safe. No one believed anyone would be mad enough to rob an entire train. But one man thought differently. His name was Bruce Reynolds. On the surface, he looked like a gentleman, sharply dressed, well-read, soft-spoken. But beneath that surface was a career thief, a man nursing an ambition bigger than any job he'd ever done. Reynolds didn't want a score. He wanted a robbery that would go down in history. And then the information he needed fell into his hands, from a figure who remains a mystery to this day. He was known only by a nickname, the Ulsterman, an insider working within the postal system who knew a secret worth a fortune. His true identity, even now, has never been confirmed. And we'll come back to that at the end of this story, because it's one of the great unsolved knots of the entire case. The secret the Ulsterman revealed was this. Every night, a special train ran from Glasgow, in Scotland, down to London. They called it the Travelling Post Office, a post office on rails where staff sorted mail as the train rolled through the dark. And in that train, right behind the engine, was one special carriage, the high-valued package coach. Inside that coach, every night was cash, a great deal of cash, money the banks were moving between each other. Normally, that coach carried around £300,000, already a staggering sum for the time. But the Ulsterman knew something else. On certain nights, after a bank holiday, when the banks stacked up their money, the figure inside that coach wasn't 300,000. It was millions. Reynolds heard this and understood immediately. Pick the right night, and this would be the single largest haul a group of men could ever carry away in one go. But there was a problem. Reynolds and his men were thieves and armed robbers. None of them had ever robbed a train. How do you force an entire train, hundreds of tons of steel, to stop exactly where you want it, in the middle of nowhere? To solve that, Reynolds turned to another gang, men who already had experience with the railways. Among them was a genuine specialist, someone who knew how to tamper with the signal system, how to make a train willingly stop without ever realizing it was being lured into a trap. And so, the crew grew. In total, around 15 men would be on the scene, plus a handful of accomplices behind them, each with a role: the mastermind, the signal man, the men to subdue the staff, the men to move the money, and one man given the job that seemed the simplest of all, yet turned out to be the link that would throw the entire plan off course on the very night it mattered. Because in Reynolds's plan, after stopping the train, they needed to drive it a short distance themselves to the meeting point where they'd unload the money. And to do that, they brought along one of their own, a man who was supposed to know how to drive a train. Remember this detail. It comes back. They prepared one more thing, a hideout. A place called Leatherslade Farm, tucked deep in the Buckinghamshire countryside, a short drive from the robbery site. This is where the gang would retreat afterward, split the money, and lie low until the heat died down. On paper, the plan was close to perfect. Pick the night heavy with cash, stop the train with a false signal, cut the lines, move the money in darkness, vanish to a hideout prepared in advance. But close to perfect and perfect are two very different things. And that night, the distance between them would be measured in a handful of small details that not one of those 15 men bothered to notice. On the night of August 7th, 1963, the train pulled out of Glasgow just before 7 in the evening, carrying 72 postal workers bent over their sorting tables and a mass of cash none of them suspected. It rolled south, toward London, toward a red light, waiting in the dark. 3 o'clock in the morning, August 8th. The driver, Jack Mills, 58 years old, saw the red light and brought the train to a stop. As we saw at the start of this story, his co-driver climbed down, found the telephone line cut, and realized something was badly wrong. But it was already too late. The masked men swarmed the engine from both sides. The co-driver was dragged down and pinned, and Mills, the older driver, was struck hard on the head from behind. He crumpled, half-conscious, blood on his face. This is the one dark stain on a robbery that even the press would later admit was brilliantly planned and executed. No shots were fired. Apart from the blow to Mills, there was almost no violence, but that single blow would haunt this entire story to its very end. And we'll see why later. Meanwhile, the others set to work on the most delicate part of the plan. They split the train, keeping only the engine and the first 2 coaches, including the money coach, and leaving behind 10 carriages and most of the postal staff. The astonishing part, in those 10 abandoned carriages, the workers didn't even know anything was happening. They assumed the train had simply suffered a mechanical fault. The plan was to pull the engine and 2 coaches a short distance further, to a bridge called Bridego, where trucks were waiting to unload the cash. And this is where the faulty link revealed itself. The man the gang had brought along, the one supposed to know how to drive, sat down in the driver's seat, looked at the controls of this modern diesel locomotive, and had no idea what to do. He only knew older, smaller trains. The vast machine in front of him was far too complex. He couldn't make it move. An entire plan worth millions prepared over months suddenly stalled over something almost laughably simple. No one in the gang actually knew how to drive the train they'd just stolen. And so, in a bitter twist, they were forced to turn back to the one person there who could drive it, Jack Mills himself, the driver they'd just beaten half senseless. They hauled him up, put him back in the seat, and made him drive the train to the meeting point. At Bridego Bridge, the rest ran like a machine. A line of men formed a human chain, passing sack after sack down from the train into the waiting vehicles. 120 sacks, around 2.5 tons of cash. The final figure, when it was counted later, came to roughly £2,600,000, a sum worth something like £50 million in today's money. Most of it in used banknotes, almost impossible to trace. It was the largest train robbery Britain, and perhaps the world, had ever seen. The entire operation on the ground was fast, clean, disciplined, and before leaving, one of the men gave the postal staff an order. Lie still. Don't call the police for 30 minutes. It was an order that sounded clever, buying the gang 30 golden minutes to escape. But that one sentence, without anyone realizing it, was the first mistake. Because when the police arrived and heard the staff repeat the threat, "Stay still for 30 minutes," they drew a cold conclusion. The robbers wanted their victims silent for exactly half an hour, which meant their hideout lay within a 30-minute drive of the scene. The net, from that very moment, had begun to close. The gang simply didn't know it yet. Right now, they were on their way back to Leatherslade Farm, vehicles loaded with cash, convinced they'd just pulled off the perfect crime. And over the next few days, at that farm, they would leave behind, with their own hands, the thing that would put all 15 of them behind bars. At Leatherslade Farm, the gang divided the enormous hall. One member alone, the man who'd later become famous around the world, took a share running into 6 figures. But there was a problem with sitting and waiting inside a house in the middle of nowhere, with 2.5 tons of money and nothing to do. People get bored, and to kill time, some of the gang set up a game, Monopoly. But instead of the fake money printed in the box, they played with real cash. The very money they'd just stolen. They picked up the notes, set them down, passed them hand to hand, laughing, and left their fingerprints everywhere. On the board, on the pieces, on a ketchup bottle sitting on the table. They had no idea they'd just signed their names all over the crime scene. The gang knew they had to erase the evidence. The plan was to clean the farm out, or better, burn it to the ground and destroy everything. They hired a man to handle it. He didn't. For reasons still unclear to this day, the man hired to destroy the evidence never finished the job. The farm was left almost untouched, with leftover food, bedding, postal sacks, banknote wrappers, and those deadly fingerprints. Then a neighbor noticed unusual comings and goings around a farm that was supposed to be empty. He grew suspicious and called the police. When officers walked into Leatherslade, they couldn't believe their eyes. An entire vault of evidence laid out in front of them. And on the Monopoly board, on the ketchup bottle, were the fingerprints that would name the gang members one by one. A special investigation squad was formed, led by a veteran detective. With the list of fingerprints in hand, along with tips from informants, the hunt began. The first man fell just days after the robbery. Ironically, he was undone by the most ordinary detail. He paid his landlady 3 months' rent in advance, an act of generosity suspicious for a man who'd recently been short of money. She reported him to the police, and then, like dominoes, they went down one by one. By the end of that year, most of the gang had been caught. Of the roughly 15 men at the scene, 12 were captured, brought to trial, and handed heavy sentences, many receiving up to 30 years in prison. The plan they'd called the perfect crime had collapsed, not because of some brilliant police work from the start, not because of a traitor, but because the very men who pulled it off, after achieving the near impossible, destroyed themselves with a board game and a ketchup bottle. But the story doesn't end there, because not all of them were willing to sit quietly behind bars. A few of the gang refused to accept their fate. One man staged a prison break in under 3 minutes, with the help of a team on the outside, and escaped so fast it defied belief. Years later, he was gunned down by a hitman in Spain. Another, the most famous member of the entire gang, also escaped. He had plastic surgery to change his face, fled from country to country, lived in hiding for decades on the other side of the world, and became one of the most notorious fugitives in British criminal history. But beneath all the legend and myth spun around this case, there were very real costs. The kind people tend to forget. Jack Mills, the driver struck on the head that night, never fully recovered. He spent his final years plagued by relentless headaches and died a few years later. The young co-driver also passed away far too young after years living in the shadow of that night. For a case the whole world dressed up with the glamorous name, the crime of the century, it's a cold reminder. Behind every grand scheme, there are real people who pay the price. And in the end, after everything, this case left behind 3 questions that have never been answered. First, most of the money, millions of pounds, was never recovered. Where did it go? No one knows for certain. Second, the Ulsterman, the insider whose information made the entire robbery possible. His true identity is still debated to this day. Names have been put forward, but there has never been a final confirmation. And third, the man the gang brought along to drive the train, the one who couldn't start the engine that night, was never caught. At times, the police didn't even believe he existed. He vanished into the dark, and no one ever learned who he was. The gang achieved the impossible, then lost it all over mistakes so small they're almost unbelievable. But what if another gang did everything the other way around? A robbery where the mastermind left not a single fingerprint, where no one was ever caught, where not a single coin was ever found. A crime so perfect that, decades later, the police still don't know who did it. In the next episode, we travel to Japan, where a single man made off with a fortune in broad daylight, right under the noses of the police, and disappeared forever. That was the truly perfect crime.